Hey everybody, this is Damon again. Gonna do another little gun video here. Got a friend of mine that owns this Ruger SR 762. Fantastic gun. But the trigger in it really isn't great from the factory. And so what he did was he went out and bought the 452 Elite trigger that Ruger makes. It's actually a really good deal on these things. They're not horribly expensive or anything, but what it does is it takes this single stage trigger to a two-stage trigger, and it lightens the trigger pull immensely. I'm going to guess it's probably somewhere between 7 and 8 pounds from the factory. I don't know the exact number, but then this probably takes it down to less than half of that, maybe 3 pounds. Considerably better, much smoother. The take up is pretty good, and I'll show it to you. It kind of comes in this little bag, it says Ruger. And then it comes with this grip, and that's just so that way you can kind of test it without throwing it on the floor. It's got a safety selector, the whole thing, so that way whenever it's cocked you can actually make sure that the safety works. And then on the fire side, it's actually got the steel up here, so that way you can actually pull the trigger, and you can see there's just a little bit of take up like that, and then the thing goes, and it's really clean, breaks really crisp. I don't know if you can see it or not, but anyway, you can tell it's a two-stage trigger. You got both sides of this thing going on. So I tell you what, let me take this lower off this upper. I'll get the upper out of the way, and so that we were just dealing with the lower. We'll take a look at the trigger that comes from the factory. All right, so here we go. We've got the upper off of it. Anyway, you can kind of see down inside here. I don't know if you can see down in there or not. It's kind of dark. But anyway, when this thing goes back, it's just a single stage trigger. Man, it's just really gritty. The gun's really not that dirty, but you can just tell that the springs they're hopped up. Anyway, and none of the parts are really polished all that terribly great. So really, it's no different than any other AR or SR trigger that you're going to do. It's really just a matter of taking out these two pins. They do recommend in the instructions for the 452 trigger whenever it goes in, being the two-stage, that you switch the safety selector out with it. That's pretty simple. Most everybody's seen that. You know, you take your screw out of here, you're going to take your screw out of here, and that lets the detent come out, so that way the safety selector comes out. Really not that big of a deal. But for the most part, let me get this thing, at least start to pulling it apart, and then I'll come back and we'll kind of talk just a little bit more. Alright, so all I've really done here is making sure that I have the right Allen wrench and everything to take the pistol grip off of these. One thing to note is you're going to go up through here, you're going to take that bolt out of that, and then whenever you pull this, obviously I didn't get that thing all the way out. But anyway, there's a spring on this side. Let me see if I can get that. There we go. Let me get that out of the way. I don't know if you can see that or not, but anyway, there's a spring. It stays right in there, and that's the detent for our safety selector. And so now, the way that should work, I think this has to be pushed down, and then your safety selector will actually come out of there. So we don't want to lose the spring or that at this point, but we do want to have the safety selector out of the weapon as we start to move forward. It makes it a little more difficult to get everything else out of there, so that's really the first step, is doing that. There's another one, I'll show you here, that comes with the new deal. Now I'm not going to use this grip, but I will use that spring and I will use the safety selector. So the next part is getting our firing group. That's the detent. Sorry, didn't notice that came out of there, but anyway, the detent's what goes up in that little bitty hole right there to actually hold it. So all of those parts stay together over there. And then at this point, it's really a matter of getting the trigger out of there. And obviously we want to make sure that this is safe. Get that thing forward, because if not, if it releases while you got your hand in there, or you can actually crack your lower here, so you want to be really careful. Then all you're going to do is just take something non-marring, and we're going to take and knock these pins through the weapon. Alright, so you can see that they're starting to push out on this side. I'm going to drive that all the way through, get that out of there. So, and then I should be able to take my hammer out of the gun. So I'm going to leave that, sit just like that. Now I'm going to do the same thing down here, and I should be able to get the trigger out of the gun. Never mind the fact that that piece went flying. And grab that real quick, and then we'll keep going. But basically, all that happened is your sear disconnector. There's a spring down inside here. This whole thing, actually got that backwards. It's going to sit down inside of there, and so whenever I relieve the tension off of it, it just went flying up. But if you've never messed with AR triggers, so this spring right here is obviously your spring tension for the trigger itself, for making that action. Sit this down, and then this spring right here is what puts the tension on the hammer to make it actually hit the firing pin. So these two kind of work in conjunction. There's a couple of faces in here that need to meet. And so now that I've got those kind of sitting out of the way, that's all of our old stuff. Let me get this lower out of our way real quick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one that just came from the factory. Obviously you take the same thing, screw comes out of the bottom. We need to keep our parts separated, so that becomes our new spring. There should be a detent whenever this thing starts to move. I just felt it fall into my hand. So there's the detent. I'm not sure that there's really any difference between the factory springs and what's there, but we're going to use their safety selector that they send with it. I think it's probably in our best interest. They probably sent it for a reason. Grab a rag here real quick. Everything's starting to get a little oily. So anyway, so all of our parts are going to stay over here now. We're going to discharge this again, or relieve whatever potential energy is there, and we should be able to push this with just one little push of the pin here, but it looks like it's going to be stubborn. So tap that and get it going. Hopefully, man, it is really going to be stubborn. There it comes. I can feel it. Boy, it wants to go, but like I said, there's some inherent tension here. There you go. So now that pin is out of there. We'll set it over here with our new stuff. And whenever I pull this out of there, it's going to try and jump out of the gun, so I'm going to be careful. There's our new hammer. This shouldn't have near as much tension on it. But there's our other pin. Saving that orientation, I'm going to put my finger over it to keep it from flying apart like the last one did. So, but then that whole thing comes out of there. And so at this point, it's important that we kind of talk about what's going on with the difference between a single stage and two-stage trigger. And I wished I had one of the little blocks to kind of show all of this stuff, but I think just from looking at the two of them side by side, you can see the difference of what's going on here. And so what happens is your reset is a whole lot better on the back end. So you don't have all that distance against the pressure of the trigger to take up in order to make that work. Also too, it's captured back here on the back end. That kind of helps. So, I mean, there's really not a whole lot left to do except for start putting this stuff back together in the gun. And so at this point, all right, just like it came out of here, I'll sit that there. This is going to go down inside the lower. Anyway, and then we want to get our hole lined up along with the disconnector. And so I'm going to take one of these pins and try and get it started here. Here we go. Looks like it's trying. Here we go. Get multiple things to try and get lined up here, and it may actually be in my best interest to do it with a pin first, something a little bit smaller, try and get this thing going. There you go. See, I push my pin all the way through to the other side, but now I notice that I've got a problem. My captured side of this thing has actually come out of here, so I can't do that. I need to slide the whole thing forward. I'll take the trigger assembly out of here so that way you can kind of see what happened to me here. And it's important not to let this happen. We talked about the captured side of that spring. Look what happened. So obviously that's a big no-no. So that's got to go back up underneath there. And like I said, the issue that I'm fighting with is getting all of those holes to line up at the same time. It's really not as difficult as it seems. Slide this down inside here. I'll get it back up in camera view here so that way we can actually see what's going on. And I'm going to push on the front first to try and get that part lined up. That's good. Well, needs to come forward. There we go. Alright, so now I've gotten that part. Now I've gotten the second part. And I'm all the way through. So now everything's lined up. If you can see down inside of there, it's still captured. Everything's good to go. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this pin and I'm going to push my roll pin punch right out of there. It takes a little bit of finagling. So, but there we go. So now the new part of that is in. And then what we're going to try and do is we're going to take our hammer and we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to try and get it in. So, but in order for that to happen, it has to go on the outside. Let me show you over here. So here's my trigger. Right, this is going to sit over the top of those two pins, like that. Actually, I've got my hammer backwards. So but it's going to sit on top of those two pins, and that's what's going to allow for that tension to take place between the two pieces. Okay, so make sure that you're oriented this way whenever you start to put things back together. And same thing, flat edge is going to be what hits my hammer, or my firing pin, sorry. I'm holding the hammer. And so once I've got it over the top of those two, then it's just a matter of getting it kind of down and into position. And this might be another good time to use my roll pin punch. Let's see if I can get that started. Get that all lined up here. There we go. So now that's all the way through. And actually with the roll pin punch, I can actually test functionality with it. It's not really necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and push back through, and hopefully I can hold all this stuff in place while that happens. There's a big chunk of it right there. The fun part is trying to get it to stay nice and straight as it wants to go through. You saw how difficult it was just pulling it out of the plastic block. I have to give that thing a little love tap to get it moving. There she goes. Still doesn't want to go all the way. So I'm going to tap that in. And you can feel when it gets solid against the other side. You can see it over here. So at this point, you need to hold it in place. I'm going to tap it from the other side, and just like that. That's why I like to use non-marring stuff. I've got it pretty well flush, but just to make sure, there we go. So now we're all nice and in with that. Obviously, hammer needs to stay forward while we take our safety selector. That's the next part. Oh, I'm lying to you. That actually needs to go back. Safety selector goes in. And to capture that, now we can actually release this, and that won't let our safety selector move too terribly much. So then the next part is, there's a hole right there. Here's a detent. That detent goes right up inside of there. Then the spring actually works better going into the grip than it does the other way around. So, well, now it's being stubborn here too. There you go. So it should stick out of there just like that. And then obviously you've got your screw on the inside. Now all you got to do is just make sure that this lines up. Let's see if I can turn this where you can actually see it. See that little spring and then that hole right there. You just want to make sure that as you start to move forward that that spring is actually in that hole. I don't know if you could hear that click or not, but anyway, and that's the way that it should be. So then it's just a matter of putting the grip screw back in. I'll do that real quick and then I'll come back and we'll talk about what it feels like now. Alright, so the grip is back on there. Not that big of a deal. Biggest thing is that now the trigger's exponentially better. You can see that we've got their two-stage trigger parts down inside there. Whenever that catches, we want to make sure that the safety selector actually works, which it does. So, and then probably what I'm actually going to do, since this is a buddy of mine, if he ever wanted to mess around with it, you could actually use this as a jig for working on triggers and so forth. It's not that big of a deal, but I'll probably put all these other trigger parts back together in this, so that way he can kind of see what he was working with and what he's got now. He spent a lot of time looking at this before he brought it to me to work on it, so I'll just put it back together. So, but there you go. So there's the new Elite trigger system from Ruger, how it gets installed. Pretty simple, not that easy at this point, just a matter of wiping the gun down, putting the upper back on it, we're good to go. Thanks.